Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We'll get started shortly here, but glad to have you join us. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. It looks like it's noon Eastern on the dot, so we'll give people a few more minutes to join us, and then we'll get started. Thanks for coming. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I have two after, so I think in Zoom land, that's like a good time to start. I'm Jessica Bell of the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center. I want to welcome all of our participants and attendees today, and thank you to We Act for Environmental Justice for holding this event with us. Before we begin, I wanted to mention a few housekeeping items. So first, just going through a roadmap of our exciting event today. We have a busy, but a great program lined up. First, we'll hear from Commissioner Willie Phillips of FERC. If you have any questions for the Commissioner, you can use the Q&A feature of Zoom to ask, and we'll see if we can get to some questions. Then we'll hear an overview of FERC's transmission planning and cost allocation notice of proposed rulemaking, or NOPR, an acronym you'll probably be hearing a lot today, from David Borden of FERC. And then we'll move to a moderated panel discussion of the proposal of the NOPR. And again, please use the Q&A feature of Zoom throughout to ask questions throughout the program, and we should have some time at the end to get to that. We'll be putting a link to bios for all of today's speakers, as well as some additional reading and resources in the chat. Now I'm going to invite Anastasia Gordon, the Energy and Transportation Policy Manager at We Act for Environmental Justice, to introduce Commissioner Phillips. Anastasia?
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you all for joining us today. As Jessica mentioned, I am the Energy and Transportation Policy Manager within the Federal Policy Office at We Act for Environmental Justice. And just a bit of context, We Act is a Northern Manhattan-based membership organization whose mission is to build healthy communities by ensuring communities of color and people of low income lead in creating sound and fair energy and environmental policies and practices. So I'm pleased to introduce Commissioner Willie Phillips. He was nominated to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, by President Biden. He was confirmed to the post by the United States Senate on November 16, 2021. He most recently served as the chairman of the Public Service Commission of the District of Columbia, named to that role in 2018. He served on the commission since 2014. He is an experienced regulatory attorney, combining nearly 20 years of legal expertise in public and private practice. He has an extensive background in the areas of public utility regulation, bulk power system reliability, and corporate governance. Prior to being appointed to the DCPSC, Mr. Phillips served as Assistant General Counsel for the Northern American Electric Reliability Corporation in Washington, D.C. Before joining NERC, he also worked for 2 law firms where he advised clients on energy regulatory compliance and policy matters. Mr. Phillips has also served on boards of several organizations, including the Board of Directors for the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners and the Organization of PJM States. He also has served as president of the Mid-Atlantic Conference of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and he has held leadership roles on several advisory councils, including the Electric Power Research Institute Advisory Council. Mr. Phillips has a Juris Doctor from Howard University School of Law and a Bachelor of Science from the University of Montevallo. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife and 2 children. Now I'll turn it over to you, Commissioner Phillips. Welcome.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Anastasia, for that introduction. I think I'm standing a couple inches taller after that. I also want to thank the State Impact Center and WEAC for inviting me here today. As usual, before I begin, I must give a caveat that the views I express today, they are my own. They don't necessarily reflect those of the Commission or of my fellow commissioners. I must also note that I can't talk about any pending contested matters that are before the Commission. So with that, I'll jump into the heart of my talk, which is about transmission. And it seems that we're talking about transmission almost daily these days. But I also have to start by recognizing that I've joined the Commission at a pivotal moment in our history. While the energy landscape is shifting, we're also facing the effects of global energy markets from the ongoing war in Ukraine, national security threats, resource retirements, inflation, and the risk of rolling summer blackouts. Yet the cost of renewable energy continues to fall, spurred by federal and state policies, corporate targets, and innovation. Renewable energy resources make up the vast majority of generation in the interconnection queues nationwide. And despite supply chain and other issues, the relative economics of renewables has only improved in 2022. This is due in part to the surge in fuel prices. Almost surprisingly, the energy transition continues to accelerate. The IEA recently reported that global spending on clean energy is projected to increase 12% in 2022, reaching $1.4 trillion. Compare this to the average 2% growth per year between 2015 and 2020. And nationally, RPS mandates have been implemented in over 30 states and the District of Columbia, and many states have significant GHG emission reduction goals. I say all of this to point out that the Commission's recent NOPRs on regional transmission planning and interconnection could not come soon enough. There is a clear need for substantial transmission build-out to accommodate new generation. And in order to get these necessary transmission projects financed and built, we must address the continuing barriers to regional and interregional transmission investment. A decade ago, FERC Order Number 1000 laid out some very good principles. However, since its issuance, no one would argue that the demands on our transmission system have remained constant. Indeed, those demands have only intensified. For those who have heard me speak before, you've heard me talk about and articulate what my core principles are. And they remain reliability, affordability, and sustainability. I'm glad to say that the transmission NOPR tackles all three of these principles. We aim to incentivize smart investments in transmission to accommodate new generation, while also ensuring grid reliability and reducing costs for consumers. Currently, most transmission upgrades are being built in a piecemeal fashion outside the regional planning process. Simply put, this is an inefficient approach to building out our grid. We need to plan for transmission that will be needed before it is needed. At its core, the NOPRs would require transmission providers to conduct long-term, forward-looking transmission planning to meet our future needs. This necessarily involves looking at the best indicators for what the future will look like, including factors like technology trends, resource plans, and federal, state, and local laws. To be absolutely clear, this does not require that transmission planners favor any particular policies over another policy. Instead, we are proposing that transmission providers plan for expected changes in supply and demand so that they can identify and resolve reliability problems and economic constraints before they affect our transmission system. Holistic planning not only ensures reliability, but it also makes good financial sense by ultimately reducing costs. I should also note that in many regions, the cost of high voltage transmission lines are being wholly assigned to new generators, which can further contribute to the existing interconnection queue backlogs. To address these interconnection queue issues so that we can bring on more resources more quickly, we have proposed moving away from a serial first come, first serve approach to a first ready, first serve cluster approach. Because the serial nature of many interconnection queues, the next generator up can often be stuck with a very expensive bill, while those in front or even behind are able to get a free ride. Now, it is not lost on me that outside of the energy context, many American families are still dealing with health and financial hardship of the past 2 years. And so we must be ever mindful as we do our work, as we work through this energy transition, that we make sure that equity is top of mind. And this includes the equity impacts of the status quo. The status quo of queue backlogs and incremental grid improvements. The status quo of denying customers the benefits of new, low-cost power options, impeding the ability of states to meet their energy demands. And the status quo that costs local, often rural communities, much needed economic development and other benefits that flow from infrastructure projects. And we know that extreme weather events can hit disadvantaged communities the hardest. Some estimates have shown that weather-related power outages cost Americans up to $70 billion a year. This is why I supported the NOPR's proposal to require transmission providers to account for low frequency, high impact events, such as extreme weather events in long-term scenarios. Increasing transmission capacity is one of the best ways that we can enhance reliability and resilience for everyone. For example, during Winter Storm Uri, SPP and MISO were able to avoid major power shortfalls by importing electricity from the East. And just last month, the Commission issued 2 NOPRs aimed at improving reliability and the bulk power system against threats of extreme weather. But as I noted in my concurrence, we must continue to look at ways to enhance interregional transfer capability to protect against generation shortfalls, especially during extreme weather. We also need to squeeze as much capacity as we can out of the existing system. This is why I strongly supported the NOPR proposal to greater consider dynamic line ratings and advanced power flow control devices in transmission planning. New technologies, such as advanced conductors and grid enhancing technologies, have the potential to enhance reliability and provide significant cost savings for all consumers. Now, as a former regulator, I firmly believe that we must work together with our state colleagues toward a shared vision for a clean energy transition. Of course, given the overlap in federal and state jurisdiction over transmission, federal-state coordination will be vital to enacting successful policy in this area. That is why the NOPR proposes to seek state engagement on the front end, which would serve to reduce costly litigation and thus bring transmission projects online faster. Transmission providers would have to, number one, coordinate with states on project selection criteria, and number two, seek agreement with states on cost allocation methods. I don't have to tell you, listening to my voice, that the large transmission lines, that they can go through multiple states with multiple regulatory authorities. This increased state involvement that we're proposing in selection and cost allocation can make it more likely that transmission projects actually get built on the timeline that we desperately need them. I also want to commend Chair Glick for establishing the Joint Federal State Task Force on Transmission. And I'm excited for the task force meeting coming up next week in San Diego. I know you will hear later from our colleague, Chair Thomas from Arkansas. It is at these meetings where we will receive state feedback on transmission NOPRs that we put forward and discuss interregional transmission policy. I know firsthand the value of hearing directly from state commissioners on what's important to them and what's important to their constituents. Finally, I just want to note, there's a lot going on with the commission right now. I know that, but I want to stress how critically important it is that we continue to hear from each and every one of you. It is important that we have a diverse set of opinions so that we can make the best possible solutions for our nation. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Phillips. Thank you for your remarks. I just have a few questions, and then we can, if there is time, take some questions from the Q&A or chat. First question being, as you noted, equity is top of the line. In your opinion, does the scope of FERC's statutory authority create any hurdles to addressing environmental justice and equity concerns into transmission planning and cost allocation?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think under the Federal Power Act, the Commission's authority regarding transmission, it's really limited to ensuring that rates are just and reasonable, that they're not unduly discriminatory or preferential. And when I'm personally considering environmental justice issues, what I'm looking for is to make sure that all parties, especially the EJ communities that we identify, have a meaningful opportunity to be heard in a meaningful way, every step of the way. I think as regulators, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that underserved, disadvantaged communities have an opportunity to access to clean energy, that they have an opportunity to have good paying energy job, access to good paying energy jobs, that we respect landowners who might be impacted by decisions where we have to build these critical transmission facilities. I think that when you look at the NOPR and the NOPRs that we put out recently on transmission, they don't directly address issues like climate change or the benefits of mitigating them. But here's what we know. We know for a fact that historically, underserved communities will be disproportionately impacted by climate change. I think the same thing goes for aging infrastructure, extreme weather. So we can debate about whether Section 206 or Section 215 of the Federal Power Act directly addresses FERC's authority to address environmental justice. But here's what I know, that if we address affordability, if we address reliability, that rising tide will lift all boats, and that includes EJ communities. And as long as I'm in this seat, I commit to you that I will make sure that I push my colleagues to put environmental justice issues first.
That's great to hear. Absolutely. I can absolutely concur with that. We need to focus on reliability and affordability, but redressing some of the historic harms to environmental justice communities. The second question I want to pose to you, you mentioned the importance of coordinating with states. Where do you see the key opportunities for FERC to work with states on transmission development?
I think as a general matter, states are generally responsible for transmission siting, and most transmission development is going to take place in states and intrastate activity. So I think when you talk about these issues, it's critical. We have to work with the states. But let me give an example of why this is so important. If you have a transmission line, a huge transmission line that crosses multiple state boundaries, if this line is selected as the most cost-efficient way to address a regional need through the regional planning process, it only takes one state to not act on or to not approve that transmission line, and the whole project could potentially fail. So what we did in the NOPR is we tried to address this issue in a couple ways. Number one, we want to require transmission planners to provide stakeholders with information about specific geographic zones where there could be significant transmission investment. We want to give an opportunity for states to weigh in on those zones. The second thing that we want to do, of course, I've talked about this a little bit, is to have more state engagement. If states have an opportunity and have a way to weigh in on how things are planned, how they are paid for on the front end, I think that we have an opportunity to reduce unnecessary delay, costly and protracted litigation on the back end. That doesn't help anybody. Another thing that the NOPR does is that we have a 20-year planning horizon that's baked into the NOPR. I think this better aligns with a lot of long-term state policies. I think that when you look at what states have to do with permitting, construction of these transmission facilities, I think that longer-term planning will serve us well. But look, I want to invite everybody. Let us know, let FERC know, let me know if we've struck the right balance on how to work with states on this important issue.
Excellent. Thank you for that. My third question, looking out over for the next 2 years, what is your priority list for FERC action on transmission development?
It's in many ways, I think the transmission NOPRs and the work we've done on transmission so far this year, it's really going to provide a pathway for FERC action in the next 2 years, in the coming years. I think the immediate first priority is making sure that we receive the comments. Their comments due on the regional planning NOPR. That's in August next month. And then October, we're looking to get comments on interconnection. We have to get those, receive them. And then we really need to push to get these rules finalized as quickly as possible. The next step, both of these proceedings have a long way to go. Transmission planners, they have to put together implementation plans that FERC has to review and approve before implementation even starts. So that's one priority. I think that one thing that I continue to look at, and I'll talk about this as much as I can, that's inter-regional transmission capacity. I think that it's so important for reliability, for what are increasingly more common extreme weather events, that we make sure that we have enough capacity that we can share inter-regionally to make up for the gap. I'm also looking at extreme weather event dockets that we have open. Those are priorities. We have a technical conference coming up in October to address cost containment. I hope that we can have some action there. I could keep going. I think that we have a busy agenda over the next couple years, and I'm excited about it.
Excellent. I can feel your excitement. I see two questions in the chat. Hopefully we have time to get to them. So first one is from Susanna. She asks, Texas grid went down last year and many people suffered during the freeze, especially people of color. How can we get the state of Texas to be part of the inter-regional grid instead of trying to be an independent so-called state?
You know, that is a good question. I think that I have been thinking about this question since my time at NERC. I mean, I think when you think about the interconnection grids that we have in the country, there are three. You have the East, you have the West, and you have Texas. I think that there are opportunities to improve, whether or not Texas is fully integrated into those other two interconnections or not. We continue to look at those. I believe that there are discussions going on right now. I'm talking about it as much as I can. So I don't know whether or not there's hope to change the way that the interconnections are set up now. But I think what we can do is continue to focus on things. And one of the things that I want to mention is gas electric coordination. That's something that had a lot of attention years ago. I think it may be time to revisit that. That's something that I'm talking to my colleagues about. And I believe that Texas can benefit from that discussion. But to be clear, what happened in Texas and other parts of the country, it just simply should not happen in 2020 or 2021 or beyond in the United States of America. We have to get this under control.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I believe that was our last question. I want to thank you again for your time. And, WEACT is certainly looking forward to continued engagement with you, especially around your core tenets, equity and affordability and reliability. So looking forward to that. And I will now pass it over to Jessica. Thank you again, Commissioner Willie Phillips.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Commissioner Phillips. It's been great to hear from you. Now I'm going to introduce our moderator and our other speakers for the remainder of today's program. In the interest of time, I'll give some brief biographical info about each speaker and then encourage you to check out the link to our event page, which is shared in the chat for full info and some other resources. So first, I'm going to introduce Anjali Patel, our moderator, who is the Vice President for Clean Energy with David Gardner and Associates and the Policy Director for Americans for Clean Energy Grid, or ASEG. I know this field has a lot of acronyms. ASEG is a not-for-profit, broad-based public interest advocacy coalition that is aimed at educating policymakers and the public on policies and regulations needed to expand and modernize the nation's high-voltage electric transmission grid to benefit consumers and support the transition to a clean energy economy. Previously, Anjali served as a litigation supervisor at the Office of People's Counsel for the District of Columbia. And then our panel today includes Yawanda Bailey, who is a detailee in the Office of Public Participation at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Previously, she worked in the technical division of the Office of Administrative Litigation. Also from FERC, we're joined by David Borden, who's a senior energy industry analyst in the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation at FERC. He's the team leader of the Commission's NOPR project, Building for the Future, addressing proposed reforms to regional transmission planning and cost allocation and interconnection processes. He has focused on a broad range of electric transmission issues since first joining the Commission in 2010. Prior to his service at FERC, he had an extensive career in utility regulation at the Illinois Commerce Commission, as well as working for multiple utilities. Next, we have Anastasia Gordon, who, as you've already met, is the Energy and Transportation Policy Manager at WEACT for Environmental Justice. A little bit more about her: she leads federal advocacy, legislative, and regulatory work in the energy and transportation sectors. She previously served as the Clean Energy Policy Fellow at the Alliance for Clean Energy New York. She also brings more than 5 years of experience in conservation and environmental policy with the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Next, we have Christine Powell, who is a Deputy Managing Attorney in Earth Justice's Clean Energy Program, where she leads a team of FERC practitioners who advocate to reform the wholesale electricity markets to support 100% clean, affordable, and sustainable grid. Prior to this role, Christine served as the Chief of Staff to 2 commissioners and an ALJ at the California Public Utilities Commission. She also served as an attorney advisor at FERC. Next, we have Sharon Segner, who's a Vice President at Ellis Power Development, LLC. Sharon has executed the company's national goals related to opening up a new sector of the energy business for independent transmission companies. She previously developed projects for Competitive Power Ventures and PG&E National Energy Group, and she served as principal advisor to the chairman of the Senate Energy Subcommittee on Energy, Senator Lamar Alexander, during the passage of the Energy Policy Act of 2005. She also has served in the White House, focusing on energy issues and federally owned hydro facilities. Next, we have Chair Ted Thomas, who was appointed chairman of the Arkansas Public Service Commission in January 2015. He serves on the Joint Federal State Task Force on Electric Transmission that was established by FERC, as Commissioner Phillips mentioned, has a meeting coming up. He also served as the president of the Organization of MISO States, and he currently serves on the Regional State Committee of the Southwest Power Pool and the NARUC Committee on Electricity. He has also served as the Chief Deputy Prosecuting Attorney, an ALJ at the Public Service Commission, as Budget Director for Governor Mike Huckabee, and in the Arkansas House of Representatives. And we also have Shelley Welton, who's the incoming Presidential Distinguished Professor of Law and Energy Policy at University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School and the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. She previously taught at the University of South Carolina School of Law. Her research focuses on how climate change is transforming energy, environmental law, and governance. And you can find links to 2 of her recent publications that look really interesting, looking at the structure of RTOs and grid regulation from our event page. So thank you so much to this stellar panel for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And now I'm going to turn it over to Anjali.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to the State Impact Center for putting this webinar together and bringing all of us together. I'm also very excited for the discussion that the issue of equity and environmental justice and building a just grid is very near and dear to my heart as well. So I am glad that we're having this discussion and I'm excited to see all the different viewpoints that are on today. So David, why don't we start with you? Could you get us kicked off with an explanation of what's in the NOPR just to set the stage for the conversation?
Hi, thank you, Anjali. Yes, I have a presentation that I can walk through on the Commission's NOPR. Just like to thank you and thank Jessica and WEACT for the opportunity to participate on this panel and to discuss the Commission's NOPR here. First off, though, I have to go through our standard disclaimer. The opinions that I may share here are not necessarily those of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or any commissioner. They are my own. Also, the presentation is a summary of the Commission's NOPR. So it's simplified, and for specific positions in detail, I recommend that folks look at the actual language in the document. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is just the roadmap for the presentation and also on the major proposed reforms that are in the NOPR. The major categories that the Commission addresses in the NOPR are regional transmission planning reforms, and under that, it is more specifically long-term regional transmission planning, a new transmission planning bucket, if you will. And the Commission is hoping to establish a framework for a more comprehensive and long-term transmission planning through a variety of proposed reforms, some of which are more specific requirements, some have some additional flexibility built into them, but essentially it is to plan over a longer time horizon, taking into account a minimum number of factors that will drive the needs for future transmission and reflect the changes in the resource mix and future resource needs, and also to reflect broader benefits. Although it's not a specific requirement, it's specifically discussed in detail in the NOPR, and to use multiple scenarios in doing long-term planning. So that's sort of the high-level regional transmission planning reforms they're all focused on long-term regional transmission planning. In addition, the commission, as Commissioner Phillips so well explained, acknowledges the importance that states play in siting and permitting transmission, and to the extent that states can be involved in this process, especially from the cost allocation side, to support future transmission build out. The commission proposes a long-term regional cost allocation reform, different from Order 1000. The commission proposes some options to have states to take into account input from states and agreement from states on cost allocation. So you can have either the ex-ante approach, a state agreements approach, or some combination of the two, and we'll discuss those later in the presentation. The NOPR also addresses federal ROFRs, which right of first refusal is what the ROFR acronym stands for, and enhanced transparency. These issues relate to competition in transmission and the concern, as well as local transmission planning, and the concern that the commission has that the competition reform from Order 1000, which still stands, could have perverse incentive or could discourage the development of regional transmission, and also a concern about how local transmission planning is undertaken in coordination with regional transmission planning. So it attempts to address concerns in those areas. And then the final main category is intra-regional coordination, which is really, it's not intra-regional planning, but it is the existing intra-regional coordination that exists today would be revised to incorporate the long-term regional planning reforms in the NOPR. And I would just point out there are a number of things that aren't on this slide and aren't part of the roadmap. If we can go to the next slide. Just as some background, the NOPR is pursuant to an advance notice of proposed rulemaking that the commission issued in July of 2021. And in that, there were a very broad range of topics, as Commissioner Phillips referenced to. It's been very busy at the commission, and the ANOPR initially took up things like interconnection related network upgrades, interregional planning, cost management and oversight. And those issues are not addressed in the NOPR specifically, but as we've seen, interconnection queue was also something that was teed up in the ANOPR. We've seen the commission issue an additional rulemaking on some of those issues, and the technical conference with respect to transmission planning and cost management for October. So it was a very large set of issues that were undertaken, and the scope has been narrowed after receiving over 5,000 pages of comments, having multiple meetings with the Joint Federal State Task Force on Electric Transmission. The commission narrowed its focus in the NOPR to those issues, under the roadmap on the previous slide. Next slide, please. And in terms of what's been motivating, or what's the motivation for the commission's proposed reforms to transmission planning and cost allocation, the commission sees deficiencies in those requirements as they exist today. For example, a failure to conduct sufficiently long-term assessment of transmission needs. So as indicated, I think in the NOPR that the commission issued on interconnection reform, something like 1,400 gigawatts of energy and storage facilities in the interconnection queue. There is just a very large demand for resources to interconnect to the grid at this time. And it's the system, the concern that the commission has, the system is being planned on a piecemeal basis, reflecting that short-term demand. And it might not be the most efficient or cost-effective approach. So the commission is proposing reforms that could address this through transmission planning, that could be more forward-looking and more comprehensive, and may address some of those transmission needs that are being driven by the changing resource mix. The next point, the failure to adequately account. You could go back to right there. Thank you. To account for known determinants of transmission needs. What is driving, the big change in resource mix and other factors that affect transmission needs? The Commission doesn't see current transmission planning processes as adequately accounting for these determinants or these factors. And so the Commission proposes a minimum set of 7 factors to account for. They would include federal, state, and local requirements, policies that affect the future resources and demand, policies on decarbonization and electrification, integrated resource planning. Those are just to name a few, also retirements and interconnection queue requests. So those would be required planning processes in long-term regional transmission planning. And finally, the Commission has noted that there's a failure to consider the broader set of benefits and beneficiaries in regional transmission planning processes today. And this is important because transmission facilities may not be identified if that are beneficial, that are net beneficial to consumers, if the set of benefits that are used is very narrow. So the Commission has an extensive discussion on a minimum list of benefits that could be planned for, but doesn't require that. And we'll talk about that a little later. Next slide. Okay, just to get into some of the requirements, I think the main takeaway from this slide is I've already mentioned the first 2 points. The Commission's proposed requirements for long-term regional transmission planning are in addition to the existing planning requirements for economic and reliability transmission needs, so that they don't replace those. So they're incremental to those processes that exist under the Order 1000 reforms today. I would also add that in terms of public policy requirements, transmission providers can meet those requirements through the new long-term transmission planning reforms, or to the extent they would prefer to keep the existing requirements they have for public policy, they could, but they would have to show that it is consistent with or superior to the proposed reforms. Next slide, please. Okay, and a little bit more detail on the Commission's proposed reforms for long-term scenarios and long-term transmission planning. The Commission is proposing a minimum of a 20-year horizon to plan across for. So it's not a point estimate 20 years from now, just that point in time. It is across that 20-year horizon to plan for transmission facilities where the needs are identified within that period. And the Commission is also requiring at least 4 scenarios, 4 long-term scenarios in this process. And these are to address some of the uncertainty. The current planning, long-term planning, is just my opinion, a little bit more on an ad hoc basis, and ranges on a time horizon that varies by region, anywhere from 6 to 15 years. Some regions once in a while might plan something for informational purposes longer, but the Commission is concerned that many of the drivers of transmission needs are over a longer term horizon, and that there needs to be a minimum planning horizon for transmission providers to incorporate in their processes. And over a longer term planning horizon, there can be a lot more uncertainty, and the Commission is proposing that transmission providers use multiple scenarios. So a minimum of 4 scenarios. You could think of it a high, medium, and low scenario to evaluate transmission needs. And also that one of those scenarios would address high impact, low frequency events. So that could range from extreme weather to reliability needs, or should people attempt to define resilience. It's flexible, and it's not defined as to exactly what that high impact, low frequency scenario should address. Left to transmission providers to bring that to the Commission. And these the long-term planning and multiple scenarios would be assessed every 3 years using best available data. And again, this is to address some of the uncertainty over time because policies and rules and laws do change and data becomes better known, the closer we get to when you expect to start construction. So the commission is attempting to provide flexibility here. And I would say that in addition, just echoing Commissioner Phillips' comments on state involvement, these processes for building long-term scenarios also require meaningful opportunities for state entities to provide their input and feedback into these processes. So the process has to be set up to incorporate meaningful feedback from states. And this is at the beginning of the process when you're determining your needs and the probable scenarios, how likely you think a scenario may be to occur. The commission is actually requiring that transmission providers provide meaningful opportunity for states to provide their input and feedback in those processes. The factors that I mentioned, the commission requires a minimum of 7 specified categories of factors that may drive transmission needs in long-term regional transmission planning. Those, I'm not going to go through each one of those, but I've mentioned some of those. And the commission would require transmission providers to consider whether to identify geographic zones. And again, there'd be state involvement there. Consider whether to identify. It's not a requirement that you have geographic zones. The transmission provider would have that flexibility working with its stakeholders, taking feedback from the states to determine whether geographic zones is an appropriate approach for them. Next slide, please. And there are some additional proposed regional transmission planning reforms worth noting. The selection process, the commission does not mandate that transmission facilities be selected out of the long-term transmission planning process, but you must have criteria to make that selection. So it must be open and transparent. This is basically applying Order 1000's criteria to long-term regional transmission planning reforms here. And in addition, the commission emphasizes that there could be a change over time. This happens today, where some transmission facilities are revised or even deselected, and the commission is requiring that you include a process that explains how you will address facilities that you may want to revise in the future in your selection criteria. The next point on this is the intersection of the long-term regional transmission planning reforms with the interconnection process. So just as a little bit of background, the commission is attempting to address a problem here where there are repeated requests for interconnection, and it's basically in the same geographic location. And those requests are withdrawn repeatedly, mainly due to the costs that are imposed on the interconnection customer. And those requests might be met in a more efficient or cost-effective way through transmission planning instead of through the interconnection process. So if a certain number of criteria are met, those types of facilities would be planned through the regional long-term regional transmission planning process. So that, and they would use the cost allocation method that is appropriate and established in that process. And the final point is the commission proposes to require transmission providers to consider the use of dynamic line rating and advanced power flow control devices in transmission planning. This is the one regional transmission planning. This is the one proposed reform that would apply to both the near-term regional transmission planning that exists today and the new long-term regional transmission planning that the commission proposes in the reforms. And this is an attempt to get more efficiency, the more efficient or cost-effective solution if possible, through the use of these technologies on existing facilities, or if there are proposed transmission facilities, new facilities under consideration, whether they might be more efficient or cost effective with the addition of these new technologies. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have a new proposed long-term regional transmission planning process, and to go along with that is a long-term regional transmission planning and cost allocation process. There's just quite a mouthful in the NOPR. No shortage of that. And so the commission proposes that benefits that you comply with the commission's rule by proposing the benefits that you will use and describe how they will reflect the benefits of long-term regional transmission planning facilities. There's a long discussion, a very, I think, helpful discussion on benefits. And I relate this to cost allocation because the commission has not changed the requirement from Order 1000 that cost allocation be commensurate with the benefits. And so the commission proposes that there are a number of benefits that have been used frequently. I'm not sure exactly how frequently. Maybe I shouldn't say frequently. They have been used in the past on some transmission facilities, and they could continue to be used, or they could be broadened for long-term regional transmission planning facilities. But the commission recognizes, this is a pretty significant step, and at this point in time is not requiring that regions adopt these minimum set of benefits, but they have to propose the specific benefits they will use, and they have to show how it's consistent with the benefits from the types of long-term transmission planning facilities and needs that they're addressing. The commission also encourages but doesn't require the evaluation of benefits of a portfolio of regional transmission facilities. That's just looking at the group of transmission facilities together instead of on a piecemeal basis, and recognizing that could maximize the net benefits or lead to more efficient or cost-effective solutions. Next slide, please. And then in terms of how regional cost allocation, long-term regional cost allocation would be undertaken, the commission deviates in a proposal from the established ex-ante approach from Order 1000. So under this approach, you can have a long-term regional cost allocation method that is ex-ante. So that would be the approach under Order 1000 today, to have ex-ante cost allocation, or a state agreement process. And that would be ex post after the transmission facilities have been identified. And you would have one or more relevant state entities may voluntarily agree to a cost allocation method, or you can have a combination of the two. So this is an attempt to encourage states to have more involvement in the cost allocation process, and it recognizes the important role that states play in siting and permitting and granting certificates to transmission facilities pursuant to state statutes. So the commission is hopeful that by providing states with additional option here, that those that they might be able to reach agreement on based on the benefits of proposed facilities and lead to more long-term regional transmission facilities being developed. So the transmission provider has to seek the agreement of relevant state entities. Those could be the Public Utility Commission or other relevant state entity. The commission doesn't decide which is the relevant state entity. Leaves that decision to the transmission provider, but notes that there should just be one in each state. And the transmission provider must provide states with a time period to negotiate the cost allocation method. So even if there is ex ante cost allocation method, there should be some time to negotiate a different method. Next slide. Okay, the enhanced ROFR, the ROFR reforms and enhanced transparency reforms. But to say on the ROFR reforms, Order 1000, the Commission indicated potential benefits from a competitive process for transmission. The Commission still believes in that, and Order 1000 process is still the default process today. But the Commission has noticed a lack of regional transmission facilities being developed since Order 1000, and a stronger emphasis on local transmission. And so the Commission is concerned that there could be, that the Order 1000 competitive process could be one of the reasons for that focus on local transmission. And so the Commission is proposing a conditional reform. So it's not a requirement, but it is a conditional reform where the right of first refusal could be established, subject to the incumbent transmission owner demonstrating that they've established joint ownership structures for those facilities. And the joint ownership structures would have to meet qualifying criteria to be established through filings by the transmission provider. The Commission doesn't explain exactly, what is the right joint ownership structure, but they do express interest in comments and concerns that something might be too minimal and would require a showing along those lines. In addition, the Commission has expressed a concern that eligibility criteria be not unduly discriminatory or preferential. Limited the joint ownership to where it excludes affiliates of a utility, and at this point is a flexible proposal on joint ownership structures. Commission is hopeful that joint ownership could bring some of the benefits through competition, such as more siting and permitting to develop basically developing more transmission through siting and permitting efficiencies, having different parties bringing different strengths to the development of transmission, having different participants enter the market, such as transmission dependent utilities or public power and non-incumbent transmission developers. So those are just some of the benefits that the Commission hopes that joint ownership could bring. The Commission notes that there is an issue with potential issue with transparency and local transmission planning processes. And so before your local transmission planning can be included in a regional plan, it must meet some enhanced transparency requirements on the criteria, and there has to be a minimum amount of meetings for states and other stakeholders to participate in, to have a better understanding of how transmission providers are developing their local transmission plan. And finally, on this one, the Commission is proposing a new approach for existing transmission facilities that are replaced, I would say in kind or through aging infrastructure, and is requiring that transmission providers submit a list of the types of facilities that might be replaced over the next 10 years to the transmission provider, and the transmission provider would subsequently determine whether those could be right-sized. So instead of just replacing like-for-like facilities, perhaps there is a regional transmission facility that could be more efficient or cost-effective. Or perhaps you can make use of existing rights of way through more advanced technology as well. Next slide, please. This is the Quip incentive reform is another proposal in the NOPR where the Commission is trying to address some of the uncertainty in additional long-term regional transmission planning processes. So the Commission is concerned that there could be an increased risk that ratepayers would finance long-term transmission facilities up front, which is what happens under Quip. That's just what the incentive is. You pay for the financing up front before the project goes into service. And so the Commission will make that incentive will not be available to facilities identified in the long-term regional transmission planning process. It doesn't change the existing Order 679 incentive on Quip or the 50% Quip that's currently available under Order 298. So that's just to balance risk between customers and shareholders so that transmission customers aren't financing upfront some facilities that may not go into service. Next slide. And the long-term proposed inter-regional transmission coordination reforms, those are basically to incorporate the results and information from long-term regional transmission planning reforms into the existing inter-regional coordination processes. The Commission is not proposing at this time to establish inter-regional planning. And on to the next slide. This is the end, and I would just again emphasize that the Commission is proposing, is really interested in more comprehensive forward-looking transmission planning to address the future resource needs and demand that are taking place over a longer horizon, and is looking for much more state involvement, recognizing the importance that states play in siting and permitting transmission, and is looking for, again, to emphasize the more efficient or cost-effective transmission facilities be selected in long-term regional transmission planning. So look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, David. So we'll get started on the questions. I'm gonna try to start with one person, but I encourage all the panelists to speak up, and we'd like to have as much of a discussion as possible. So please feel free to jump in. So Anastasia, why don't we start with you? Could you talk about what you think are some of the top challenges facing the grid today? And are there pieces of the NOPR that give you hope that we're headed in the right direction?
Thanks, Anjali. And I think the commissioner kind of stated some of the things that I was going to bring up, particularly, the fact that the grid is aging and can't handle the increasing pressures of climate change. We talk about high impact, low frequency, but I would argue it's increasingly getting, more frequent as the climate worsens. And of course, we know that communities of color and low-income communities are more susceptible to power outages that arise from these increasing frequencies and severity of natural disasters. You have the Gulf Coast hurricanes, the West Coast wildfires, heat waves, Texas's deep freeze. And so that just amplifies the need or reiterates the need to modernize the grid and expand to new renewable energy generation. And so, this NOPR gives me hope that, we can onboard some of that renewable energy and energy storage within our grid system, that we can access that. But also, as I mentioned, planning for more renewable generation. As we've mentioned before, there's congested power lines and lack of connectivity and coordination and poor planning. And so the NOPR gives me hope that there's that increased coordination and increased forward-looking long-term planning can really leverage, a cleaner grid, but also start planning for the increase in load in terms of building and transportation electrification, which is needed to not only reduce indoor and outdoor pollution that mostly affects communities of color, but also is increasingly important to decarbonize the entire economy. Those are the two sectors that are, especially in New York, where we're headquartered, are responsible for most of the climate causing greenhouse gas emissions. So that gives me hope, but specifically, I would, just say that there's, in reading parts of the NOPR, there's no emphasis on prioritizing EJ communities where, those who are suffering from power outages and just historic disinvestment because of discriminatory land use practices. And then we have to consider, siting of transmission infrastructure and the undue burden that might have in communities of color and areas of low income. And I believe that, the increase in state coordination and regional planning is important there.
Thank you, Anastasia. Did anybody else want to provide comments on this general question about the challenges facing the grid today?
I might chime in. I think Anastasia did an amazing job outlining some of the major challenges, as did Commissioner Phillips. I was maybe just going to chime in a couple things on the second part of that question that you asked her, which was what gives you hope in the NOPR? And, as I was reading the NOPR, I agree that it didn't directly address EJ issues perhaps as explicitly as it could have, but I'm really grateful for having this conversation that highlights how these changes actually have huge justice implications. So I want to just say thanks for letting me be a part of that. Two things that I think the NOPR does really well in terms of moving the ball forward are that it brings together some issues that I feel like were being talked about disjunctively up until now, right? So one set of issues that I really like it tying together is the interconnection challenges on the one hand and the regional transmission planning challenges on the other, right? I think the NOPR does such a nice job of thinking about how these are really interconnected challenges and trying to solve them in a coordinated fashion. And the other thing I think it does really well is think about state interests and federal processes and how you can try to synergize those, because we all know those have been a big roadblock in the past. And just in general, I think FERC is really, it's demonstrating to me like more awareness to politics and real world impediments and trying to think very pragmatically about how to make some progress here. So those are just a couple things that I would say I celebrate about it.
Thank you, Shelley. Christine?
Yeah, thank you. And real quick, I just want to say thank you to WEAC and NYU's State Energy and Environmental Impact Center for having me. But I also wanted to make a more discrete comment on the challenge that everyone's been talking about. And that is that some of the regions have limited or no transmission capacity to accommodate new generator interconnections. And one example is in the MISO North Central region, where there's just pretty much no transmission capacity. And it's already showing that it's problematic for ratepayers. MISO just had its recent capacity auction that resulted in a shortfall for that area, about 1,230 megawatts, which is not in and of itself a large number, but it does trigger aspects of the capacity markets that will increase rates to customers in that area. So, again, it just drives home the importance of this NOPR and, what Shelley and Anastasia have already mentioned, in that, the interconnection improvements that the NOPR proposes will help to resolve this issue quite a bit. And it does require the grid operators, as David has articulated very well, to incorporate local state RPS goals. So, as the rule gets implemented, assuming that's going to be the final rule as it relates to scenario planning and the interconnection requirements, it will help with this major issue, I think. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Christine. So I wanted to pick up on one of the comments that Anastasia made about public participation and the overburdened communities. Often the ones who are overburdened don't have resources to participate in FERC's processes. So Yewande, I'm going to ask you this question about how can transparency and participation be enhanced in both transmission planning and FERC's processes regarding transmission planning? And do you see a role for OPP, the Office of Public Participation, in helping with that?
Thank you, Anjali. I just want to start with the same disclaimer that my FERC colleagues had, that my opinions are my own and not representative of the commission or commissioners. So yes, so speaking to that, in terms of enhancing transparency and participation, I think the first part of that would be early engagement with communities and public early in the processes, not waiting till whatever proposal is formally mostly put together and then asking for input at that point. So I think that's the first part of that, enhancing engagement early on. And I think the second part would be, in this particular NOPR, you've had the ANOPR and the NOPR, and you had multiple stages where comments and reply comments are permissible for the public and anybody else who wants to engage in the process. So I think that gives an opportunity for different groups of people to come in. In terms of how OPP can facilitate this, we're really focused on education, process transparency, and assisting the public with filing comments, pointing them in the right direction, giving them insights on how to do this. And as a plug, we actually are holding a workshop on August 30th on how to file comments for the public. So we're trying to bring people who normally traditionally have not been engaged in this process in that way. So that's kind of where we are with that process right now.
Could I just, I see Sharon is off of mute, so I'll let her go first.
I would just say that Sharon Segner from LS Power, and thank you for the opportunity just to be on the panel and provide substantive comments. But as a starting block, as a starting point, the Office of Public Participation is critical. And I do think that if you look at Chairman Glick and his leadership over the last couple of years in this area, I do think that this has really been a high point. And the importance of public participation, being involved in these processes, cannot be overstated. And I would say that LS Power takes the views that consumer advocates, they're very often very involved in the stakeholder process and the RTOs and the such, but often are more limited in terms of what they can do at FERC once the issues pop up to FERC. But certainly LS Power would be more supportive of appropriate resources being granted to those consumer voices, not only in the stakeholder process, but in the FERC processes. And that the public participation aspect of this is critical. We are talking about trillions of dollars potentially in transmission spend, and it's mind-blowing if you think about the cost aspect. And as a private sector company, we support a greater role for our consumer advocates and a greater role for folks having honest conversations about affordability with all this, because if the transmission is not affordable, at the end of the day, these proposals they will fail at some point, because the consumer backlash ultimately would be so great to derail this. And so keeping the affordability issues front and center is vital. And we certainly, as a high point in all of this, we would say that would be something that Chairman Glick has been very good on. Thank you.
Yeah, I would also reiterate that the need for early and often engagement, especially prioritizing, yes, affordability, which is, a key tenet in energy justice and what we support, but just also, you spoke about, Yewande, having these how to do's and how to file comments, and you need to prioritize the Office of Public Participation, I should say. It should prioritize just knowledge and capacity building for affected communities and reaching out to environmental justice advocates often and early, as I mentioned, addressing some of the barriers for engagement and intervening and providing comments for these very long proposals is completely necessary. Many organizations don't have the time to assimilate a 500-page NOPA, nor do they see the relevance of it to them. So contextualizing these rulemakings in a way that they can substantively provide feedback would be great. So I'm offering that to the Office of Public Participation, as well as engaging with our tribal leaders, our tribal nations, and ensuring that there's enough time so that there's those capacity building sessions, but also giving communities time to engage and actually provide those substantive comments. And we've already WEACT has already provided comments on previous for instance, the policy statements that came out earlier this year. It was our first time engaging, and even just the process of writing comments and submitting that was essentially very convoluted, and just clarifying things like that. We've also recommended looking at already established documents like promising practices for EJ methodologies and NEPA reviews that was created by the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice and National Environmental Policy Act Committee. These are the kind of things that can provide resources for the Office of Public Participation to actively engage with environmental justice communities and actually get that robust and meaningful stakeholder input that you're missioned and tasked with.
Thank you, Chair Thomas. You're up next, and I'm actually going to ask you one additional question to go with your comments. Can you talk a little bit about public participation on the state level and how that could help inform FERC's processes and regional transmission processes as well, because you deal with this every day in the cases that come before your commission?
Yes. First of all, thank you all for having us and putting this on. And I'd like to agree with my colleagues on the panel in terms of the importance of public outreach. But the first point I would make, though very, very important, it's also very, very challenging. It's very, very difficult to do. I mean, even if you took Commissioner Phillips and David Borden's remarks, and even a fairly educated group of folks would have trouble understanding what those folks were talking about. And I mean, we all do because we're in this and we're familiar with it. But the public is less familiar with these technical things. And even if you can get that right, which is a resource question often, so that you have someone with expertise representing a group, you have a second challenge, and that's an information gap. Often utilities control all the information. And so even if you can get an expert to the table, if they don't have some equivalent access to information, they're not going to have the type of participation that it should take. Of course, we face these challenges also at the state level. The biggest two we hear about are and then the siting stuff. Everybody knows that siting is challenging. The cost stuff right now too is just the AP had a headline. We have a cost of living crisis right now that I think is taking the whole energy debate and turning it on its head because of natural gas prices. That, for example, in the NOPR, I believe it's the concurring opinion of Commissioner Christie, makes some points about, it's not FERC's role to do the resource mix. We're into just and reasonable rates. But when you move natural gas from $1.80 to $10, and you don't have alternatives, you turn the whole debate on its head. We need transmission to make sure that people have alternatives to these high gas prices, and trying to build solar in the supply issues and with the queue is really, really difficult. The whole debate is turned on its head with these prices. And that's the main two things we hear from state engagement. And when we do public hearings and all of that, and when times are quiet, we don't actually hear that much. We've had public hearings where nobody showed up. We had a public hearing where we drove in and we thought we had 2 commenters because there were 2 people in the crowd that none of us recognized. That was the parents of one of my colleagues on the commission just going to check out what their daughter does. That's different now when the costs go up and it's more front of mind. You see it bubbling up at the public, but the engagement stuff is very important. As a regulator, we work for the public. Those people are who we're here to serve, and it's our job to listen to them. It's our job to listen to them whether they know a lot about the topic or a little bit about the topic, and they just want to vent out to listen to them. I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Shelley.
Yeah. So I just wanted to chime in and suggest, I think there's 2 different participation challenges. And one is how to get groups involved in front of FERC and in rulemaking processes. And I think that's the easier challenge. And the harder one is, what do you do at the RTO level? Because that is where a lot of the initial decisions get made. And it's much more Byzantine, much less transparent, much more technical. And I think it's a really tricky question. I think the NOPR tries to start to get at some of the transparency issues. I have even really struggled when I've tried to participate in RTO meetings and the volume and the technicality of them. And so I'm not sure we are far enough along in thinking through how you actually get even robust public interest group participation in RTOs. And I wonder if there's more to be done thinking through what kinds of participation we ask RTOs to engage in beyond just opening their very technical meetings. Are there requirements we could put on RTOs in terms of the sort of the scope and the tenor and the type of public engagement that they're having during their transmission planning processes? I think that's something that maybe merits more consideration.
Thanks. And I know a number of folks on this panel are engaged in RTO processes. Are there examples where it's worked better? I agree there, to be very engaged at the RTO level, you have to attend every meeting, and people don't have time for that. Everybody has other things on their plate, and it's very hard to understand and follow processes if you can't be engaged all the time. But are there examples around the country of either regional transmission planning regions or RTOs have done it better to engage the public or public advocates?
Well, I think it starts off at a very basic level of saying in which RTOs do the consumers, the folks that are paying for this, in which arenas do they actually have a meaningful vote and a meaningful voice? And a starting point is that the governance relating to the individual RTOs in terms of who has the filing rights there's a big debate over 205 filing rights and who has it and who doesn't. But to the extent that the membership of these RTOs is structures where the consumers have a good, strong voice, that is very important. And I think that PJM, while it's certainly not a perfect RTO, the governance structure where the consumer voting block is very significant and more significant than in other RTOs is important. And I also think that the voice of the states in SPP is very good from the standpoint, and we'll talk about this later on the transmission NOPR, but in SPP, the state commissions essentially have 205 filing rights at FERC relating to state public policy projects. And that's actually something that LS Power supports. And we believe that that model in SPP should actually be replicated in the other RTOs. And we see this as a deficiency of the NOPR that's on the street.
Thank you, Sharon. Chairman Thomas.
I want to very much agree with Shelley's comments in terms of the complexity. It's nearly constant meetings around the clock. And sometimes I joke that I'm just a little cog in a big RTO world. We had 2 RTOs in our state, SPP and MISO. We spend a lot of time working on these issues. They're very complex, very detailed. And for someone that's not eyeballs deep in this stuff, it is instant overwhelming. And that's a problem in terms of getting access. Most of MISO, I think, does a good, they divide up into sectors. Some of their voting is structured on sectors. You have transmission owners, you have utilities that buy transmission service from others, but then you also have the environmental community is there. Other folks can participate, but still you have the information gaps and the expertise gaps that really make it challenging. And it's a cost issue. There's travel, it's constant. It's really hard to get it right, but also really important, as I said earlier. And we'll talk about the SPP thing later too as well. Thank you.
So Chairman Thomas, I'm going to stay with you for a minute. Do you mind talking a little bit about how state clean energy policies should be incorporated at FERC and whether into transmission planning and whether the NOPR strikes the right balance? Commissioner Phillips was asking for comments on that. Does it strike the right balance between state authority and state involvement with planning, FERC's planning jurisdiction? So what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I think that it does a pretty good job of striking balance. A lot of the processes, the NOPR basically gives a bunch of suggestions and says, states, if this is what you want, bring it to the table. The biggest challenge with implementing state policy is when states have different policies. And then there's a fight about the cost allocation with respect to the different policies. And what they're trying to do is basically come up with a format, in my view, for the states that want to do this stuff. And then even beyond that, across the RTO regions, when you're doing regional, to give them a method and a format for doing it. We'll see what the final rule has. It's of course, Commissioner Christie is very vocal as a former state commissioner, like Commissioner Phillips, in terms of the state role. That will have to be balanced. There's a lot of structure that is optional. In the proposed rule, we'll see how much of it is optional to let the states do it and more mandatory as the rule process goes on. But I do think it does strike a good balance. You have to have a regional approach to integrate renewables. The optimal places from renewables are often far away from the load. That's worse with wind than solar because of the capacity factors on the high plains. You have more flexibility in terms of where you put solar, but it still has a large geographic footprint where you're going to want it it's less affordable the closer it is to the people, just driven by real estate values. So what you need is a broad footprint. That's why transmission and renewables are tied together in terms of policy. The broader your footprint is, of course, each generation type has various engineering and mechanical challenges. With renewables, it's the intermittence. A broader footprint helps you deal with intermittence, because when you're on the high plains, the wind might not be blowing at any given moment, but somewhere on the high plains, it almost certainly is. And of course, the same thing now that this challenge is a little bit less with respect to solar, because particularly on the summer side, because the sun is what drives your load. So what drives your load also drives your generation. Now, it doesn't get all the way to the peak in the early evening, but it still is more correlated to peak often than wind. But again, bigger footprint more flexibility and optionality helps with a lot higher, helps the system be able to integrate a lot more renewables. I hope that was responsive to your question.
Thank you. Did anybody else have comments on this balance between state and federal jurisdiction, whether the NOPR strikes the right balance? Christine?
Thank you. I had really brief comments. I agree with what was said, but I think it's great that the NOPR recognizes that transmission planning must consider local and state RPS goals, obviously. But I think that for the states that have policies that provide that the energy transition, which is primarily driven by these RPS goals, but that the energy transition must be just and equitable. I think that the NOPR could take a more direct and focused approach on outlining a process for that. And so I'd hope to see that, that change with the final rule. And I think that even NARUC and other state entities made comments to that effect to the ANOPR. So I think that in general, there's some really good points of interaction with the existing NOPR, but I can definitely see room for improvement there. Thank you.
Thank you. Shelley?
So, I think fundamentally, the challenge that the NOPR is trying to solve is that you've got two legal requirements, right? One is that states get to determine their generation mix. It's written into the Federal Power Act. They get to decide. They're setting legitimate goals. And you've got this other principle that beneficiaries are supposed to pay for transmission, right? And it's setting up this challenge where some states are saying, look, we don't want to pay for other states' clean energy or energy justice goals. And I think the NOPR starts to try to get at this tension in some interesting ways, right? So as David described, it gives this option for states to get together and figure out how they want to do cost allocation for long-term planning projects. I am really curious to see whether or not that gets over the log jams that we've had so far. It might be that it does, and it might be that you have the same kind of holdout problems that we've seen in the past. The other thing that I think the NOPR does that is an interesting and important step is it says, look, benefits are broad from a lot of transmission projects. If you're building a project for clean energy, it doesn't mean that it just has clean energy benefits. It may have reliability and economic benefits that span throughout a region. And it starts to call for regions to do a better job identifying these collaboratively. I wonder if it could go further. I wonder if it could be a bit more specific in the benefits that have to get identified and how they all have to work together. But right now it provides regions a lot of flexibility, which I understand they very much want, and perhaps this bottom-up approach will work. But I think really trying to make the benefits consideration as sort of ample as possible would go far in even helping states to sort out for themselves some of these decisions about how to pay for these projects.
Thank you, Shelley. Sharon?
Yeah, I would just comment that I think that the state provisions in the NOPR ultimately is going to rise or fall on the question of what happens if the states don't agree and can't agree on cost allocation. What happens? And as I read the NOPR as it's proposed, there is a little bit of vagueness on the topic. And I think that's why we are in a comment period. But as I read it, if there's not agreement among the states, the parties that hold the 205 filing rights can advance to FERC if there's not agreement within a time certain. And I think respectfully, I understand the tension that FERC has in this issue, but I don't think that ultimately that's the right answer. The right answer is what SPP has, and the states have the 205 filing rights. These are their state public policy projects. And if the states can't agree, then, I think it's questionable about whether or not that 205 filing should be made. But I read the NOPR as allowing a 205 filing to be made if the states can't agree. And then I think it's problematic, because if you look at what passed out of Congress several months ago or last fall in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there's language in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that says if a state denies the CPCN, a party can go to DOE and FERC for backstop siting authority. So what do we have in this situation if a state doesn't agree on the cost allocation within their date certain, which is good, the states are at the table more than they have been. That's definitely a plus. But what happens if you have a state that doesn't agree on the cost allocation? The 205 filing has been made at FERC because they don't have the 205 filing rights. And on top of that, because of the combination with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the state doesn't even have ultimate control on the siting portion as well. And I think that combination is something that folks are not talking about as much in terms of looking at what just passed out of the bipartisan infrastructure bill combined with these 205 filing rights. And in my mind, that says that FERC should be going more down the path of what SPP has in the RTOs. And if FERC has to make a public interest finding in the non-SPP RTOs in order to allow those states to have it, then so be it. But it's not a workable situation where, if the state doesn't agree on the cost allocation, then they're just a step along the way before going to FERC.
So Sharon, one clarifying question, just in case the folks on the line aren't as aware of the SPP filing, is that limited to filing for a transmission project subject to their state public policy, or is it that 205 filing right broader than just transmission?
Ted may be a better answer this than I do, but the way I read an SPP is it's related to public policy planning. And it's, the challenges, different states had different public policy goals. And in SPP, the RSC has the 205 filing rights for state public policy transmission.
Chairman Thomas?
Yeah, the precise, it's over cost allocation. So for FERC filings over cost allocation and resource adequacy, the 205, which filing rights, which are equivalent to the utilities, where you just have to prove what you're doing is just and reasonable, are with the state. There's also 206, which is when you're challenging, that has a higher procedural bar for 206. You have to demonstrate the existing is not just and reasonable and that your alternative is. So it's a process thing where it shifts the burden of proof, but it's cost allocation and resource adequacy. With respect to benefits, and one thing on this, we'll see how much of my draft, I'm drafting the NARUC comments on benefits. I have a slightly different perspective. I think the way the NOPR handles it is good because they have a list of proposed benefits and methodologies that you should consider. And to me, the key with benefits is if you do it on a dollar volume, the traditional benefits are going to cover a very high percentage of that. It's squeezing the last 5, 10, 15% out that you need to move, that you need to examine these other benefits. And to me, the issue is always, is it verifiable and quantifiable? And to me, what the FERC NOPR does is it provides a forum where states that and regions that want to push the envelope on benefits can use rigorous examination to quantify and verify benefits. And then over time, what we'll develop is best practices. There's a fellow named Johannes Pfeifenberger, who I think is with Brattle, that's done some reports. And when you get, you might have 30 benefits and the most money is in a few of them, but when you're pushing and stretching to try to get every dollar, it's easy for the critics to say, well, it's not quantifiable. Well, to me, the answer is not to lessen your rigor with respect to quantifiable. It's actually to increase it in a way that Johannes Pfeifenberger, who is an advocate of transmission, does. And I think the way the FERC NOPR is set up, where it says here's some things you should think about, and here's also very importantly the methodology that you measure them, that as time goes by and the Pfeifenbergers of the world get in there and use rigorous examination to develop the benefits, then best practices will flow from that. I know that's different than calling out a question with NRG. I think that's a better way to go than say this are the benefits that you must consider, because if you do that, all of this is voluntary, as we've been discussing. How I think these interregional things, what about the state that doesn't want it? Well, that's going to just define the region differently. So what you want is the broadest possible region with the broadest possible consensus. And how you get that is giving them input on what the benefits are. If you're too prescriptive, it's too easy just to check out. So I'm not going to play. To me, the way you get the rigor is having that list. And we'll see how much of my comments make it into the draft and how much make it into the garbage can. But that's why this is a top of mind. Thank you.
Well, and to follow on that, and Christine, I'm going to call on you to answer this first, that there's been some discussion about trying to advocate for a mandatory list of benefits, similar to what FERC has or what MISO uses for its MVP process, in order to help with interregional planning. The NOPR is very light on interregional planning, and potentially we may get another NOPR on that, but it seems like this could help set this NOPR could help set the stage for future action. What are your thoughts on getting a set of benefits that every region should look at, and then allowing some flexibility for additional ones, sort of like Chairman Thomas was talking about, developing new ones in the future? And then, sorry, two-part question. When we talk about environmental justice, that is an important benefit, that transmission can help support equity initiatives for communities that don't have access to transmission or capacity needed for lower cost resources. That's a newer in quotes concept. Have you had any thoughts about how that could be examined by regional planners?
And sorry, if you can explain that part, what can be examined?
Environmental justice and equity benefits from building new transmission lines.
Great. Yeah, I'll start with your first question. Establishing at least a minimum set of benefits will help with the interregional planning process, because then the two regions will know which projects are in sync and will provide benefits to both regions. So I think it helps there for consistency. I have one caveat, I'm not the expert in this area. We will have really good comments on them, so look out for them. But yeah, so just having that kind of just baseline consistency is needed to sync up the two regions as they do planning. And then you're also ensuring that certain benefits are always going to be there for these projects, especially the benefits that will tie into making the rates affordable. And I think that's really important. And I think that's what the rulemaking is trying to do. So I think to the extent that those benefits could be realized in all projects, or maybe with a caveat that, and this is just me speaking, demonstrate why this benefit, is not going to be achieved here. So just adding that extra burden to folks who don't recognize certain minimum benefits that will relieve rates, which will definitely help the environmental justice communities and everyone, but definitely environmental justice communities. And then, switching to your second part of the question on benefits specific to environmental justice communities, I think we have to be careful here, because, the benefits will also feed into how cost allocation is determined. And, I kind of think of environmental justice communities as having already paid it forward in shouldering a lot of the health impacts from being a harmed community. So I think that, the equity planning should be ahead of time as the RTOs identify the transmission need. The DOE has great data on where the disadvantaged communities are in our country. And I think that, it'd be nice to take that into consideration when looking at the transmission needs, and maybe not a requirement for everyone, but where states have really said this is an important part of the transition for us to make sure it's just and equitable, to be able to provide them with that data up front, since they're at the table and, in terms of making some of the decisions here. I think that would make sense. So hopefully I answered your questions.
Any additional comments on that front, on the benefits front? If not, we're going to switch gears a little bit. And Sharon, I know this is an issue that, oh, sorry, Shelley, did you want to add something on that?
No,
I noticed Anastasia's hand was up.
Oh, apologies. Go ahead.
no, that's fine. That's completely fine. I just wanted to support that idea of having, a minimum list of benefits, including environmental justice. And, going back to my point about relevancy, it's important that, transmission providers do begin to start analyzing upfront and early what benefits can be derived in again, redressing some of those injustices, because they have, as Christine said, they have, borne the brunt of harms and health inequities from, infrastructure development, including transmission. So that's something that I would highlight. And then, states themselves, as we talk about data, states themselves are already identifying disadvantaged communities. And in New York, the Climate Leadership and Protection, Community Protection Act, does state that 35 to 40% of clean energy and investments and energy efficiency investments benefit historically disadvantaged communities. So that's, states are actively trying to come up with criteria around how to identify these communities and what investments might look like for these communities. So that's something that states are already moving towards, specifically New York. And so I completely agree that there's data out there. Also, there's the Justice 40 screening tool that identifies disadvantaged communities that we've actively participated in providing comments for. So there's data out there for transmission providers to kind of quantify what benefits can be derived for these communities.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, and Sharon, and apologize for missing your hand. It was up in the corner, so it's a little hard to see sometimes on Zoom. So Sharon, competition, let's chat about competition. What do you think the NOPR got right and wrong in terms of competition? And how does competition play into costs and consumer benefits? Well, it's a two-parter here.
Well, I'll start with the first one. And we approach the situation from the standpoint that if the clean energy transition is not affordable, it's going to be very difficult for it to be politically sustainable in terms of the reality of the situation. And so cost and affordability issues have to be top of mind, because if you want these transitions to occur, it's got to be affordable. And, we are in a situation right now, CPI numbers just came out this morning. In the last, the annualized electricity services inflation rate came out this morning for electricity at 13.7%, an increase of 1.7% over the month of May, outpacing the overall inflation, which increased at 9.1%. So we are in a situation where electricity costs are trending higher than the overall economy's inflation. And with that backdrop in mind, FERC said in this NOPR that partnerships might be an adequate substitute for competition. And my company would say, with due respect, that a TO raising their hand and saying, hey, I have a partner with one of my other TOs, is not an adequate substitute for competition. It's not an adequate substitute among qualified players coming to the table, sharpening their pencil, and a substitute for market forces coming to bear on transmission that is impacting and that's forecasted in the hundreds upon hundreds of billions of dollars. And so we think that FERC made some critical missteps in terms of their proposal to limit competition. And we strongly oppose both of their proposals to scale back competition for joint ventures, as well as this right sizing ROFR as well that they propose. And we don't think that it's adequately supported in terms of what they put out. And it's wrong on the law and it's wrong on the policy. And we're going to have a lot to say in the comments in that regard. And I would also say that this is something that's got implications for the entire NOPR. You need it to be affordable. And this isn't something that you can just sort of push over to the side and, you know, lob it in with a whole bunch of other policy changes and hope that it's all okay. We realize it's a political environment, but at the end of the day, competition is in the public interest and they should stay the course.
Thank you, Sharon. Chairman Thomas?
As a philosophical matter, I agree with Sharon's comments. I will offer some speculation though. Why would the FERC step away from that? I think one of the things that FERC is trying to do, we've heard of the MVP projects, which were MISO North projects about 10 years ago. And I think what FERC is trying to recreate or hoping to create is future things like the MVP projects. But what that was is a bunch of states had renewable goals. They got together. It started at the level of the governor's office, and they negotiated where would the transmission be, what renewables that we think will be deployed, what renewables should you procure in your own state, which are probably more expensive. The cheap ones were the wind in North and South Dakota. What percentage of the renewables should come from there? And they agreed on everything. Now, how does this relate to competition? Well, the utilities are part of that big agreement because they're going to get the investment. And what I think the fear is if they don't get the investment, then they don't play along in this grand political compromise, and then you don't get the regional planning. That's what I think their fear is. The other problem with the competition is not really working. The state ROFR, which is right of first refusal laws, have in a lot of ways gutted the competition policy, in my view. That's where the state incumbent, if there's a bid project, you have the winning bidder, then the state incumbent can come in and step into their shoes if they can do the project at the same price. Well, if you're the bidder and you might get your rug pulled out from under you, you're not going to bid. And we've seen the competition shut down where these state ROFR laws are. And again, that's the political influence of the utilities in the state legislature. And I think that FERC fears that if you don't have the utilities in this big political, that won't happen. So that's because they're trying to replicate what happened with MVP. That's my speculation on why. They've said they're not stepping back from competition, but I think that's why in this instance, they're limiting it how they are. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we are running short on time, and I apologize. These conversations could go on for hours. There's always so many interesting things to talk about, but that maybe we could round it out with one last set of questions. There's also two for here. One is that, as Chairman Phillips alluded to, there is a lot going on at FERC. So what else is exciting you about the other orders that are coming out, the other topics that FERC is discussing on transmission? So that's question one. And the second one is that has come in from an audience member about when we're talking about these impacted communities and who should be involved in reparative restorative work, how do we identify those communities and get them engaged? And if any of you have any good examples of that, we would appreciate hearing it. So two sort of very different topics. You can address both or just pick one. And Shelley, we're going to start it off with you.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I mean, there's almost a head spinning amount of stuff going on at FERC right now. I'll come back to where I started, which is that I really applaud the agency for trying to tackle these issues in concert. I am eager to see where they go on interregional planning. I think that's going to be a huge piece of the puzzle that we haven't really seen unlocked yet. And then I'll just point out, perhaps more broadly, that we're in a position where we're seeing renewables grow tremendously, and it's something to really celebrate. We are not seeing emissions come down or fossil fuel supplies start to be constrained at the level that we need to see them be. And so I think the other piece of the puzzle that's important here is, what are we going to do on the supply side of the system? Obviously, FERC has in place a very controversial set of proposals around what to do with pipelines. I very much have my eye on that in terms of thinking about how do we really move towards a system that is not just adding renewables on top of fossil fuels, but really effectuating a transition. Maybe I'll leave it there and let other people have time to comment.
Great, thank you, Shelley. Christine, do you want to go next?
Sure, I was just making a little rough outline here. I'm a lawyer, I like to outline. So basically, I completely agree with Shelley. I think the interregional NOPR is going to be really exciting. I think that's where we're going to really see a lot of transmission development that's going to take, wind from where it's blowing all the way to the highly populated centers of the country. So that's really good. Also, what FERC does on some of the minimum transfer capacity requirements there, I think that'll be good. I was in California during August 2020, working for Commissioner Randolph. So it was a tough time when we couldn't get the imports that we needed, but the governor jumped into action along with the other state agencies to relieve our ratepayers at that point. But in any case, I think that the transfer capabilities will be really, really important. So looking forward to those two things. And I guess how to reach out to folks who are impacted. Earth Justice, we have a partnerships department, and that's kind of their focus, is to look at potential new clients and to understand all of our clients around the country. So that helps us engage with folks who are paying attention to climate change and our frontline communities. But I think that, and it sounds really generic, but I want to say something. But I even just Googling and looking around for organizations that are, focusing or trying to get involved in climate change, I think people will find that there are quite a few frontline communities who are interested in climate change, and they understand that our energy utilities are a key to solving that issue, doing the transition. So I know that wasn't a great answer. I can't think of top of mind specific. There are a couple of associations to start with, and it's just not really top of mind. But I know that maybe start with your a partnerships or a client relations group at your organization, and Google. Thank you.
Chairman Thomas.
In terms of upcoming FERC, as Commissioner Phillips mentioned, there's a NOPR on interconnection. That's the easy stuff on interconnection. That was a 5.0. The hard stuff on interconnection is participant funding questions. Currently, much of the interconnection is funded by the developer up front, even though there are arguably benefits to the system that come from that, and coming up with a sharing mechanism will be complicated, challenging, but also very important. I think that's the one that I'm really looking at. On the supply thing that Shelley worried, I worry about the cost. When you constrict the supply and the costs go up, you create a political environment that undermines the goals. These gas prices are there's not, I'm talking about natural gas. The other gas is a whole problem beyond our deal. It's really, really hard to say, okay, now we're going to decrease supply more and the price up and send the price up, when right now the whole country's freaking out about their electric bill. How to balance that is very difficult. It's very important, but that's a real concern. That to me, the environmental justice thing is different when gas is $1.80 a million cubic feet and $10 a cubic feet. If you went down to any place, a church, a community hall, anywhere, and said, what's on your mind about energy right now? They're going to hear cost, 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 cost. And that is what the folks on the street, that's where their heart is. And I know these other issues are very serious and we need to tackle them, but our ability to tackle them is going to be stripped away if we don't do something about these costs. Thank you.
Thank you. Anastasia?
Yeah, sure. I just want to tag on to that. While I agree, we're in an unprecedented time in terms of inflation and gas prices, and affordability is key and should be addressed. We also have to think about the health and exposure disparities of the current fossil fuel economy. And so it's necessary for, as you mentioned, Chairman said, the need for more transmission to access renewable energy and also onboard energy storage so that we can start accelerating the retirement of some of these dirty power plants that are really disproportionately overburdening environmental justice communities and who are already on the front lines of climate change. So, while I agree energy affordability, there's also the need to push towards, accessing renewable energy and energy storage and all the benefits that come from that in terms of carbon reduction, emissions, toxic fine particulates, and all these other air pollutants that are associated with fossil fuel power plants, etc. And just in terms of your second question, Anjali, which I don't completely remember right now, but just in terms of identifying environmental justice communities, reach out to your local environmental justice organization or community-based organization like we at. We also coordinate, I didn't mention this in my introduction, but we also coordinate a group of environmental justice organizations and advocates all over the country. So it's a national network, and we're working together to advance climate justice. It's called the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum. And again, I also want to mention the fact that states like New York have criteria for identifying disadvantaged communities, also California, and there's the federal screening tool that's being developed right now. So there are ways to identify environmental justice communities. Just have to reach out.
Thank you. Sharon?
I'd say I'm looking forward to FERC evolving, and I'm looking forward to seeing FERC evolve to be more consumer oriented in its policies. I think that I look at many of the orders that have been coming out, and I think there's room for improvement in terms of on affordability issues and consumer policy. So I'm looking forward to FERC muscling up and doing and addressing the issues. I think there's more they could do on local transmission, and I don't think the NOPR did the job in that regard. And so I'm looking forward to FERC being stronger.
Thank you. Yewande and David, we're going to close out with you. Are there things that you want to talk about FERC that are coming up that we should be aware of, or questions that you think that are on FERC's mind that you'd like to hear from the public about? Maybe you can start and then we can go to David.
Sure, I can speak to what the Office of Public Participation is doing. I plugged it earlier. Since we're really here for education and engagement with the public and try to bring them to the processes, we're really kind of working on our August 30th workshop and commenting. And so that's one thing that we have coming up. And we do plan additional things in the future like that, just to bring people in and give them information and get them more involved in the processes here.
Great, thank you. David, you started us off, now you can get to close us off.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just want to point out that the Commission, in following up on Sharon's comments about cost, the Commission does have a technical conference scheduled for October. I believe the docket is 8022-8, and that is to address transmission planning and cost.
Oh, we may have lost David.
Oops, did I break up?
Okay.
Yeah, you got to transmission planning and costs, and then you broke.
Okay. Okay. I'll slow down. Transmission planning, cost management, and oversight, including local transmission planning criteria, and how that fits for this technical conference. We're looking for a very insightful discussion and a number of panels on these topics. And we also look forward to comments, like Sharon has pointed out, on competition. The Commission has a proposal out there, and it's an incremental step. The default policy is still competition as Order 1000 has established it. Subsequent orders have tweaked, it's got a history of its own, but we certainly encourage and look forward to comments on those issues. It's certainly a challenging issue with a lot of different competing incentives and competing policy goals, and I should look forward to hearing the comments on that proposal.
Great. Well, I want to thank all the panelists. It's been a great discussion. I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica.
Yes, thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you, Anjali, for this great discussion. Also, a big thank you to Commissioner Phillips for providing his remarks. But Anastasia, Chair Thomas, Christine, Sharon, Shelley, Wande, and David, we so appreciate you sharing your insights. Thanks to WEAC for co-sponsoring this event with us, and with the State Impact Center, and thanks to all of our wonderful staff working behind the scenes to make this a success. A recording of the event will be available shortly on our website. There are some links in the chat that you can check out for more info.